It was supposed to be a routine flight from Detroit to Buffalo. Clear skies, no turbulence, nothing out of the ordinary. But just 5 minutes after takeoff, a deafening bang shattered the calm. A cargo door had blown off midair, the cabin floor collapsed, and the pilot suddenly had barely any control. Passengers clung to their seats, while flight attendants fought to keep each other from being sucked out. This was American Airlines Flight 96, and what happened next changed aviation forever. So how did the pilots manage to land a crippled DC-10 with half its controls gone? And why wasn't the problem fixed before hundreds more died? In this video, we will uncover the full story of Flight 96, from the engineering flaw nobody fixed to the terrifying in-flight chaos and the global consequences that followed. So, let's get started. On June 12, 1972, American Airlines Flight 96 looked like any other transcontinental flight. It was a DC-10 scheduled to travel from Los Angeles to New York with planned stops in Detroit and Buffalo. At first glance, everything appeared standard. Passengers boarded without delay in LA, and the plane touched down in Detroit at 6:36 p.m., 46 minutes behind schedule but with no reported problems. After the Detroit stop, most of the original passengers disembarked and a new group boarded, bringing the total on board to 56 passengers and 11 crew members for the short leg to Buffalo. The aircraft in use, a McDonnell Douglas DC-10-10 with registration N103AA, was nearly brand new. It had only been delivered to American Airlines in July 1971. While that sounds reassuring, the DC-10 was still a relatively untested model in commercial service. The cockpit crew included 3 experienced men: Captain Bryce McCormick, age 52, First Officer Peter Page Whitney, age 34, and Flight Engineer Clayton Burke, age 50. But only 2 had more than a handful of hours on the DC-10. And despite their limited DC-10 experience, they were considered highly capable. What they didn't know was that the plane they were flying had a known issue, one that had been flagged but never properly resolved. Just 3 months before the flight, ground crew in Detroit reported trouble with the cargo door. The latches weren't locking properly using the electrical actuator, so the door had to be forced shut manually. Then, on May 30th, just 2 weeks before this flight, McDonnell Douglas issued a service bulletin. It warned operators about electrical failures in the latch actuator motors due to voltage drops, making them too weak to secure the door correctly. But the upgrade was optional, not mandatory. American Airlines hadn't performed the fix on this specific aircraft, and the warnings didn't stop there. Inside Convair, the subcontractor that built the fuselage for McDonnell Douglas, an engineer named Dan Applegate was already sounding the alarm. Just weeks before Flight 96, Applegate submitted a written memo detailing how the DC-10's cargo door could blow out mid-flight if it was closed improperly. He warned that the locking system was too easy to override and could give a false sense of security to ground crews and cockpit indicators. That memo never made it past internal channels before Flight 96 took off, and just 5 minutes after takeoff from Detroit, the consequences of that oversight would come crashing in with a sound no pilot ever wants to hear. At exactly 7:20 p.m., American Airlines Flight 96 lifted off from Detroit Metropolitan Airport. The aircraft had only been in the air for 5 minutes, climbing steadily toward cruising altitude. As the DC-10 climbed through 11,750 feet over Windsor, Ontario, everything still looked normal from the cockpit. Then it hit. A loud thud shook the aircraft. In the cockpit, fine particles of dust blasted into the pilots' faces. Captain McCormick, startled by the force and debris, thought they'd collided with another aircraft. His first instinct was to check if the windshield had blown out. Behind the cockpit, the cabin dropped into chaos. There was a deep rumble, followed by a strange pressure shift, and then the rear section of the plane opened up. The cargo door had blown clean off the fuselage. The explosion didn't just blow open the side of the aircraft, it took part of the floor with it. The rear cabin floor buckled and partially collapsed. It wasn't built to handle a sudden pressure differential like that. The cables that controlled key flight functions, rudder, throttle, and elevators were routed under the floor. When it gave way, those cables were damaged and severed. The rudder pedals jammed hard to the right. The thrust levers moved out of position on their own with the number. 2 engine, the tail-mounted one, getting stuck at idle because its control cables were cut. The plane yawed sharply to the right, destabilized mid-air, and started an uncommanded descent. Loose luggage was sucked into the gaping hole. A 6-foot casket with a passenger's remains was ejected straight out of the aircraft. And in less than a minute, a normal flight turned into a full-blown emergency. The crew had a half-responsive aircraft with damaged flight controls, passengers in shock, and a wide hole at the back of the fuselage. But the worst part? They still had to figure out how to get it on the ground. With one engine useless, the rudder jammed, and limited control of the aircraft, the crew had to fly blind, balancing power, angles, and nerves. So how do you land a broken jet with a hole in its body and half the controls disabled? After the cargo door tore off and the cabin floor partially collapsed, Captain McCormick quickly realized that the rudder pedals were jammed fully to the right, which explained the sudden yaw that had pulled the aircraft off its intended path. He tried adjusting the thrust levers, only to find that engine number 2, the one mounted in the tail, was unresponsive. Its control cables had been severed. Engines 1 and 3 still worked, but they'd have to be carefully balanced to keep the plane flying straight. The ailerons, which control roll, were barely functional. The elevators, which pitched the nose up or down, were slow to respond and limited in movement. The plane was barely maneuverable, but it was flying. McCormick and First Officer Whitney quickly agreed. They needed to get this aircraft on the ground before the situation worsened. They contacted air traffic control and declared an emergency. At first, there was consideration of diverting to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio. It had longer runways and was better equipped for a catastrophic landing. But there was one problem: time. The longer they stayed airborne with damaged controls, the higher the risk of complete failure. Detroit Metro was closer and they knew the terrain. McCormick decided they'd return immediately. Stabilizing the aircraft was a challenge on its own. With the rudder stuck hard to the right, they used 45 degrees of left aileron to fight the turn. That wasn't enough on its own, so they adjusted the throttle manually, more power to the left engine, less to the right. That kept the plane mostly straight. But it wasn't smooth. Every adjustment had to be done with care. One wrong move and the plane could spiral. As they approached Detroit, they faced one more hurdle: how to land a nearly unresponsive jet safely. Normally, pilots lower the flaps to 35 degrees during landing to increase lift and reduce speed. But when they tried, the plane's descent rate jumped to a dangerous 1,900 feet per minute, way too fast to land safely. McCormick quickly increased speed using engines 1 and 3, leveling out the descent and bringing it down to 700 feet per minute. At 7:44 p.m., Flight 96 touched down on runway 03R. The moment the wheels hit the tarmac, the plane veered right just as expected. First Officer Whitney slammed the left engine into full reverse thrust and left the right idle. The maneuver worked, and it came to a full stop just 270 meters from the end. Inside the cabin, 11 people had minor injuries. No one was killed. However, the real test came 2 years later when another DC-10 cargo door failed mid-air, but this time there was no recovery. When American Airlines Flight 96 landed safely in Detroit after its cargo door blew off mid-air, it was seen by some as a victory. No one died. The pilots brought the plane down against the odds. But that near miss wasn't just a one-off fluke, it was a flashing warning light. Engineers, regulators, and the aircraft manufacturer had a second chance to fix a major design flaw before something worse happened. Instead, the warning was buried. And on March 3, 1974, it happened again. Turkish Airlines Flight 981, another DC-10, took off from Paris, headed for London. Just minutes into the flight, the rear cargo door failed in exactly the same way as Flight 96, but this time the consequences were catastrophic. The cabin floor collapsed completely, the control cables were severed, the crew lost all ability to fly the plane. Within moments, the DC-10 plummeted into the Ermenonville forest near Paris. Everyone on board was killed, 346 people. At the time, it was the deadliest single aircraft crash in aviation history. We have covered this in detail in another one of our videos, so definitely check that out. That crash finally triggered a full-scale response. The FAA issued an airworthiness directive, forcing McDonnell Douglas to redesign the door latching mechanism. Visual inspection windows were improved, the actuator motors were upgraded, crew training protocols were tightened, and international regulators started treating cargo door integrity as a top-tier safety priority. Decades later, the legacy of those two flights still shows up. In April 2025, a United Airlines 777 was forced to divert after a cargo door sensor triggered a warning mid-flight. No door actually failed, but the memory of past failures was enough to ground the jet immediately. So, while the DC-10 faded from passenger service years ago, its story remains one of the most important turning points in aviation safety. It showed how human lives can hang on a single overlooked component, and how ignoring a close call can end with hundreds of funerals. So, what's your take on the terrifying story of Flight 96? Should more have been done after the first incident to prevent what came next? Drop your thoughts in the comments, give this video a thumbs up if you found it eye-opening, and don't forget to subscribe for more jaw-dropping aviation stories. Until next time, fly safe.